All right. All right, everyone, let's get the show on the road. So thank you. All right, so in recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's spiritual connection to country and in continuing ACU's commitment to reconciliation, it is customary to acknowledge countries we pass through. Today, we acknowledge and pay our respects to the First Peoples, the traditional custodians of the lands and waterways. We thank them for their continued custodianship. We acknowledge and celebrate the continuation of living culture that has a unique role in this region and all campuses of Australian Catholic University. We also acknowledge elders past and present and thank them for the wisdom and guidance as we walk in their footsteps. Now I'd like to have Professor Herb Marsh introduce today's brown bag speaker.
Well, we're very lucky to have Rich Ryan join us today. He hasn't, because of COVID and so forth, he hasn't been able to spend nearly as much time with us as he hoped, and we hope so. It's just wonderful that you're able to come back. Thank you for attending our Brown Bag seminar series. Today's presentation will probably be the highlights of the Brown Bag series this year. Without further ado, thank you.
Thanks.
Herb, if this is the highlight, I'm really sorry about the series. But thank you very much, Herb. Thanks. I'm going to talk today about flourishing in schools. I'm going to talk about education today, and there's a reason for that. I'm going to go first here. The reason for that is I looked past at all my brown bags here. So I've now been at IPPE for 10 years, which is really hard to imagine that 10 years have passed since I first joined this institution. And so I looked over each of the brown bags that I've given in the past, and I realized in looking over all these topics that the one topic I'd never talked about here was education. And I think that's because everyone else is doing that here. I didn't, but Herb and I, we gave a talk one time at Strathfield on education, but that was a large talk. It wasn't a brown bag. So I thought that would be the thing to do for today. And before I do talk about it, I want to give thanks to just all the collaborators that I have really globally on all of the different kinds of work we do. It's such a privilege to be part of the self-determination theory community and to be able to work with such talented people all over the world. But then I particularly want to thank the IPPE motivation group that is really where almost all the good work that I do comes from. And I want to particularly thank Emma and Stefano and Jasper and Kelly, who's here today as well, as Emma. And Ben, who's not here. And then this is Shannon Hope and Sarah Soley, who's been my right-hand person for about 20-some years now, and who helps me accomplish everything. So I just want to give thanks to all those people. So I'm going to talk about education today, but in the self-determination theory work we do in education, it's really the same question that we're looking at in every sphere that we look at, which is what is it that allows people to flourish? When we're looking at educational settings, we're thinking about how is it that students flourish, how is it that teachers flourish, and we use that term a lot in this institute and in others. So I'm just going to say a little bit about it. I just wrote a paper with 8 philosophers and 2 sociologists, and of course, this is when you write with philosophers, you see you can quibble a lot about the definitions of things. So after much argument, this is the definition that our philosophical team came up with, that flourishing is really to develop one's capacities and the vitality, relationships, and wellness. It's really a well-rounded, healthy development, because it comes from this idea of flowering or bursting forth with the potential that you have within you. And the argument in self-determination theory has always been that flourishing is sort of in our nature. It's in our nature to flourish, to grow, to become all that we can be. But in order for that to happen, we need certain nutriments. And we need certain supports in the environment, or otherwise it won't happen. And as all of you know from all of those past brown bags, when we think about nurturance within the self-determination theory perspective, we think about the support for people's basic psychological needs. When we think when you nurture, when you're helping somebody flourish, you're helping them experience autonomy in what they're doing, experience relatedness in the groups that they work with, and experience efficacy and competence in what they're doing. And where people don't flourish is where any of these basic psychological needs are being frustrated. So where people are feeling a lack of autonomy or feeling controlled or pushed around in some way, or where they're not feeling able to accomplish things or master the tasks that they're given them, or where they're not feeling connected with the social groups. And you'll see that in schools, these are all really big issues. In fact, one of the reasons that it's good to talk about schools with respect to the SDT model is schools are always, in a way, natural experiments. We can see lots of variation, classroom to classroom, school to school, institution to institution, and how much students' basic psychological needs are being supported versus thwarted by the policies and practices that are there within. John Marshall and I and some of our colleagues wrote a chapter on this recently about what schools are like for a lot of kids, and then also what they could be. And partly what I will talk about today is the sadness I have after working in this field for now 40 years of how little schools have changed, despite how much evidence we have about what needs to happen in schools. As I say, 40 years ago, the very first, I'm a clinical psychologist, as many of you know, and I would not have become a researcher at all except for some early accidents that happened to me. And one of them was the accident of working with a DC on a classroom experiment that we were doing in the city of Rochester. So this is one of the oldest, this is probably the oldest piece of research that I was involved in. And in this study, we went to a suburban classroom environment and we asked teachers about their own teaching style. And we had a series of questions that we called the problems in school questionnaire, and teachers filled it out and told us how they would handle different problems in school. And when we looked at their answers, we classified some teachers as controlling teachers. So they had a problem with a student in school, they would use reinforcements or controls or punishments or sanctions as a way of managing that. And then we had other teachers who say, well, if I had a student who was a problem in school, I would have to find out what was going on for that student. I'd have to empathize with them enough to understand where the obstacle was, and then that would be their starting point for solving it. And we called those autonomy supportive teachers. And then we followed the children in their classrooms. So these were teacher reports in the summertime. And then we got into the classrooms. And in this first study, we couldn't get into the classroom until 4 or 5 weeks into the school year. And by then, these were the relationships that were already established in those classrooms, which is that teachers who reported being more autonomy support had students in the classrooms who reported more mastery motivation, more independence in the way they went about their work, more curiosity about their schoolwork. And the opposite was true, of course, for teachers who were more controlling. Their students were less curious, less interested in mastery, less wanting easier rather than more difficult problems. But as a young clinician, this was the thing that really concerned me, which is 4 or 5 weeks into the school year, children in a controlling classroom were already feeling less good about their cognitive capacities and less good about themselves. And this was robust enough findings. And, we followed them up with a longitudinal study and some other studies that I thought, this is, I'm trying to have an impact on children as a clinician, but this was a big impact being had on children every week in every classroom, in every school across our region. And so this would be an interesting area to get into research. And I still have a long, strong interest in intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is really, I think, when we think about it, it's the things that we learn just out of curiosity and interest in trying to understand and master our environments. And it's natural to all of us. And most of the learning that goes on in life comes from intrinsic motivation. But we don't harness it enough in schools. And so I will emphasize that point today. There are other motivations we'll talk about, but intrinsic motivation remains, I think, a core kind of motivation that we want to harness in schools and we want to get the best for our children. And the real reason I put the slide up is because that's my granddaughter on her first day of preschool showing mastery motivations. But as I say, intrinsic motivation is just one kind of motivation. And all of you who've heard all my previous brown bags have heard this ad nauseum. But we think that there's a number of motivations that students can bring to a classroom. Some students come to a classroom and they are what we call amotivated. They're really not, they don't find value in what's being taught to them, or they don't feel capable of mastering what's going on in classrooms. And so they withdraw effort and become amotivated. Still others, their motivation is based on external motivation. They're doing their work in classrooms because of rewards or because of fear of punishment. And while this is a motivating state for people, it will get people to act. It's a very poor quality form of motivation, which will show up in poor quality performance and doing just the minimum to get by. Still a little bit further up on this continuum of motivations is what we call introjection. Introjection is when a student's performing in school in order to feel good about themselves or not to feel bad about themselves. Often this is related to the contingent or conditional regard that they're getting from parents or from teachers who are showing them more or less respect as a function of how they do in schools. So while this can be a strong driving force for motivation, I think it is for students all across the spectrum. It's a very fragile kind of motivation, and it can be really harmful to mental health, particularly when students run into challenges. Still further up on this continuum of autonomy is what we call identification and integration. And this is when students are studying because they may not be having fun or finding it interesting, but they know the value of what they're doing. They have a rationale and they can appreciate that studying at school has some utility in their lives. And so we call that identification. And then, of course, intrinsic motivation, which is a highly form of autonomy, high autonomous form, because when you're intrinsically motivated, you're doing something willingly because you find it interesting and fun. So this represents a continuum of autonomy that goes from lack of autonomy and very little autonomy all the way up to a good deal of autonomy in what you're doing. And students usually have multiple of these motives working. So if you tap any given student, they may have some level of introjection, some level of identification, some level of intrinsic motivation. So we try and measure all those motives. And so we see these as each having their own characteristics, but it's forming a continuum in terms of relative autonomy. And there's lots of ways of showing that. We've had lots of different psychometric evidences to show that this is a continuum. It forms a simplex when you put the correlations together. That shows that things that are next to each other on this continuum are more highly correlated. It's also been shown with bifactor ESIM analysis, in which we can see that the loadings on the S factors are systematically higher as you go up or lower as you go up the autonomy continuum, meaning when you saturate the G factor with autonomy, there's not much left over when you get to intrinsic motivation, but there's quite a bit left over at the lower ends. There's just lots of different ways of showing it. So I think the simplex structure of the autonomy continuum has been well established. This was shown recently in a meta-analysis that was done by Howard and Gagne and Julien Bureau, in which they did a multidimensional scaling analysis of many studies looking at the continuum. And you can see that there is a continuum that they found here in multidimensional scaling. This is a one-dimensional MDS with intrinsic at one end and amotivation at the other. And they found the same pattern for employee samples, for student samples, and for mixed samples. So recently we were looking at this in our own labs in a different way. And this was a study that was led by Stefano Di Domenico, and we have it under review now. So we're on the second or third round of the review at this point in time. So we're keeping our fingers crossed on this one. But what we did in this was we took all the motivation scales we could find in education, all of them that we could dig up in the literature. We ended up identifying 175 subscales from 100 different questionnaires that measure motivation within the field. And we gave those to multiple samples so that we could look at the structure of those using what's called a Bass-Ackwards analysis. And this is basically a hierarchical principal components analysis, where you do a first principal components analysis, and then you do principal components on each of the facets that you bring out of that until it breaks down, until there's nothing you can make sense of later. And the idea is to see how many facets are there, how many different kinds of motivation would grow out of all of these different questionnaires. And when we reduced it to that level, we found that there were 26 different facets that we could identify of pockets of motivation that had some coherence. And they're listed here on the side. Things like interest and enjoyment in school, proactivity, being absorbed, feeling strain, self-forgiveness is, that you're kind to yourself after challenges and failures. So many different things were out, and then we subjected them to an MDS. And if you look at the MDS, what you can see is on this end, things that look like what we would call autonomy are here. So intrinsic motivation, identification in the sense of feeling proactive and creatively engaged. And then you get toward the middle, you see things like pressure to be perfect, competition, impression management, seeking fame. These are all things that are associated in our model with introjection. We're doing something because there's a contingent self-esteem related to it. You get down even further, you can see that more controlling things like fear of shame, anti-intellectualism belongs there, not having choice, anxiety about tests are down at that far end. And then finally, at the way far end, boredom, aimlessness, procrastination, things that are associated with amotivation. So it looks a lot like our continuum of autonomy, not using our measures. So we did a second study where we replicated the facet analysis that was in here with a new sample. And then we also put our own measure of SDT's motivations into the MDS. And this is what we found, which is still similarly, we find all of these different facets are raying, at least on one dimension, on something that goes from autonomy to control. And then we find that our identified motivation, intrinsic motivation, positive interjection, negative interjection, sort of in the middle. And one of the things that this analysis teaches us, not only that almost all types of motivation have some degree of relative autonomy within them, but also that we have a lot of work to do ourselves to fill in measurement here in the middle. So we're pretty good at measuring the extremes. When we get to interjection, there's a lot of dynamics in interjection we could measure more exactingly. And I think that's one of the things that we've learned from this particular analysis. But anyway, one of the things about SDT is the more you get up to this end, the more positive the outcomes. That's what we've always claimed. The more autonomous you are in engaging the activity, the more you're going to be wholeheartedly into it. Your quality of your work is going to be better, and you're going to have a more positive experience. And so one of the more recent studies showing this is a meta-analysis. And the last time I gave a brown bag here, it was on meta-analysis. So any of you who remember that, well, good for you. This was one of the meta-analyses that was in that. This was led by Josh Howard at Monash University. And in this meta-analysis, we had 344 samples, almost over 200,000 students involved in these samples. And we were focused on SDT's motivation taxonomy and what it looks like across studies. And the first thing you'll see in this is that we're looking at maladaptive and adaptive outcomes. And we looked at 26 different outcomes in this meta-analysis. And if you go to the paper, you can find the results for all 26. But it's kind of a summary slide on this. We grouped them as adaptive outcomes. This included academic performance, academic engagement, efficacy, mastery approach, how much vitality kids had in the classroom. And then maladaptive outcomes like absenteeism, dropout intention, anxiety, depression, boredom. And you can see that the more autonomous a person's motivation is, the more adaptive the outcomes, and the more they're not adaptive outcomes are not occurring. And the opposite is true for maladaptive outcomes. The more autonomous, the less likely those are to occur. So this was pretty strong evidence in support of our speculations about autonomy. When you look at grade point average, which is a thing that a lot of people really care about, is how well a student is performing. You can see here that autonomous motivations identified in intrinsic are positively associated with grade point averages across these studies, and aim motivation and external motivation not so much, and interjected somewhere in the middle. So just as we would expect. A lot of times when we're looking at simplex correlations, we see that interjection is poorly correlated with outcomes. And people will say, well, why do you need to measure it if it's poorly correlated with outcomes? Because it's a regular kind of motivation people have. And it's important to show that this kind of motivation that we see in so many children is unreliably connected with outcomes. So when you're doing things as a parent or a teacher that promote interjection, you're not necessarily promoting good outcomes. And so that's an important thing to show. So a zero prediction is also a prediction. And that's just a thing that I think I don't like RWA analyses for these reasons. Now, to me, the most important thing when we're looking at flourishing in students is not their achievement, it's not their grades point average, but rather this, which is their well-being. Are they thriving in school? Are they feeling good about themselves? Here we're looking at both positive and negative well-being outcomes. And the positive outcomes, we have positive affect vitality, SE, social emotional functioning, satisfaction with school, and enjoyment. And you can see that autonomy is linearly correlated with more enjoyment and positive outcomes in school. And the opposite is true with ill-being outcomes, depression, anxiety, negative affect in school. So to me, as a clinician, this is the most important thing, which is, are we doing the things to motivate children that allow them to feel well and to feel thriving? And this is an important result. Just one other meta-analysis that we have under review right now. This is just in L2, in second language learning, and almost all these studies are students learning English in another country. I think there's only one or two that are non-English language classes. And here we were only looking at achievement outcomes. We had done a previous one looking at engagement and showed what it was supposed to show, but this one is just looking at whether the study included a measure of our measures of motivation and included either a comprehension test, a vocabulary test, or a grade for the language classroom. So that we only identified in here really 21 studies which had multiple effects inside them. And you can see here that intrinsic motivation is the most strongly correlated with performance in second language classrooms. The average correlations were 0.27, identification 0.16, and then the more controlled forms of motivation not predicting performance within these classrooms. And that honor here, Abdullah Alamar, who led this particular study. It's not just academic classrooms, it's also non-academic classrooms, things like music. And when we look at motivation in music, we can see how much it matters for outcomes there as well. This is a study that was led by Paul Evans at UNSW and Professor Nakata. That's why I was at UNSW the other day, meeting with him. And here he's looking at music students in Australia and New Zealand and in music schools. And what he looks at here is how their autonomous motivation predicts their practice quality. So how frequently they practice their musical lessons, what the quality is as they rate the quality of their practice, and then whether they choose challenging versus easy pieces to practice. And all of these are positively predicted by more autonomous outcomes, which are themselves related to how much psychological needs support they feel within the music school. So the long story short is this, which is that more autonomous motivation predicts better outcomes in schools, not only academic outcomes, but also the evidence of thriving, that people feel good about themselves in such contexts. So if that's the case, and that is the general case, then what we want to do is we want to promote more autonomous forms of motivation and engagement in school and in self-determination. We think the way to do that is to support people's basic psychological needs. And if you want to kill motivation or autonomous motivation in school, do things that threaten or thwart their basic psychological needs. So when we look at the supports for basic psychological needs, we just finished another meta-analysis that just was published in JPSP. This is not particularly school-based study. This is looking at all the studies in the literature where there's been a measure of autonomy support, competence support, and relatedness support, and then motivational and well-being outcomes. And this is the growth chart of studies in this area. And you can see that there's been this dramatic growth in studies of psychological needs support, but almost all of them are autonomy support. Very few studies look at relatedness support, and very few studies look at competence support in schools, at least through this framework. Now, there's a reason for that, and skip to the reason for that, which is in the SDT, we think autonomy support is pretty core, because when you engage in autonomy support, you tend to satisfy all three basic psychological needs. When you support autonomy, you're also paying attention to the person's struggles with confidence or issues with mastery. So you're probably more likely to be responsive to them around confidence issues. You're understanding their perspective, so they're going to be feel more connected with you because they think you understand them more. So when you do things that support autonomy, it tends to support all three basic psychological needs. So it makes it a good focus for interventions. Again, when we define autonomy support, it's really supporting the willingness and volition of the individual students. And so how does that occur? That occurs because first you try and understand that student's perspective. You understand the struggles as they see them, the interests as they have them. You take part in their world as part of trying to motivate them. You also seek out their ideas and interests. You ask your classroom, what interests you? Or what can we do that would be interesting here? Or how does this interest you? Those things would matter in terms of students feeling like their perspective is being taken into consideration. when they're engaged in tasks, you're trying to create tasks so that they can feel ownership over their own learning. So project-based learning being a really good example of that. If you learn through project-based learning, you feel like you're the person who's putting together your project and showing and demonstrating your mastery so that it's a place where you can really feel ownership. Think about the opposite of that, which is I have a bunch of information I want to give you. I'm going to tell you the information and I'm going to test you on it afterwards. There's no sense of ownership in that relationship of knowledge transmission. We offer meaningful choice wherever possible. So if there's different ways students can go about a task, or if there's different assignments that they could do to show their mastery, we provide those choices where possible. And we minimize the use of controlling language. No shoulds, no musts, no have tos. More about giving a rationale of why is something important to do? Why would we be engaged in this activity? So that there's an internal anchor for wanting to do it. I submit to you that none of us do anything autonomously unless we have a rationale for doing it. So when administrators pass down a new rule to us, we want to know why. And if we have a good understanding of why, then we can willingly undertake that. But when nobody tells us why, we can't autonomously do it. It can only be an outside order. And so providing a rationale is important. And finally, just in general, empathizing with resistance and struggles. You know, if you're a teacher and you see that your class is struggling with something or disinterested in something, rather than telling them to suck it up and get to it, you try and understand why is there resistance here? What's in the way? And so try and remove those obstacles. So these are all techniques of autonomy support that I think then lead it to be a way. And I like this graph that I really stole from John Marshall's chapter in the SDT volume. He's arguing in that chapter that when to be a good classroom teacher, we've shown that the elements are you have a high degree of autonomy support, but also a high degree of structure, and you're very involved with your students. You care about them, and you're investing energy in them. But structure has to be done in the spirit of autonomy support. I can structure in a very controlling way, or I can structure my classroom in a very autonomy supportive way. And it's only autonomy supportive structure that leads to the good outcomes. And I can be involved with my class in a very heavy way, but it could be very controlling involvement, or it could be very autonomy supportive involvement. Same is true with our parenting literature. And again, involvement has to be done in an autonomy supportive manner. So it's the autonomy support is the overarching sensibility that we would bring to parenting or teaching or management activities. Now, this ability of autonomy support to affect all three of these has been shown in lots of different studies, and I just put this one up because it's, I think, one that shows it nicely in a path model. This was a study that was led by Young-Shim Yang with Korean students, and she was looking at autonomy support, perceptions of autonomy support and control in Korean teachers and its relationship to the need satisfaction of Korean students, classroom experience, and then how that's related to various outcomes. And you can see that more autonomy supportive teaching was associated with more autonomy, competence, and relatedness need satisfactions. And these in turn are associated with positive outcomes, including achievement and intrinsic motivation and engagement. Now, there's just another new meta-analysis that's just come out, and this was led by Josh Howard at Monash University. So I just read this a couple of weeks ago. They assembled 542 studies with 637 samples, and then looking at outcomes that were associated with autonomy, competence, and relatedness supports in the classroom. So these are all student-focused studies. I just took out some of their summary graphs from their paper, but you can see that when we look at performance in school, and this is mostly GPAs in most of the studies, it's grade performance in school. What you see is autonomy support fairly robustly related to better performance in school, whereas autonomy thwarting is negatively related to performance in school. And here's the GPA over here, just specifically GPA. You can see grades are lower in classrooms where students experience the teacher's autonomy thwarted. Now, to get to stuff that has to do with engagement, if we look at engagement behavior and engagement emotions, again, positive engagement behavior is related to more need supports and negatively related to autonomy thwarting, and emotion engagement is related again to all three negative thwarting factors. So that all of us are associated with less emotional engagement in classrooms. And then finally, they looked at things like externalized misconduct, emotional well-being, and emotional ill-being. And these follow the pattern that we'd expect from our ideas about autonomy support, which is that autonomy support is negatively related to externalized misconduct. It's positively related to emotional well-being, and it's negatively related to ill-being. So again, getting to the most important things we're doing in schools, which is helping students thrive, these supports are crucially important. Just want to get back to the music thing again. This is another study from Elizabeth Freer and Paul Evans. This was an Australian study where they're looking at students opting in to music in high school. So in the structure of the schools that they were looking at here, students have to take music up through 8th grade. But in 8th grade, they get the option of whether they're going to continue to do any music or other electives. And most people say, well, the students that are going to continue in music are the ones who already have talent or already have experience in it. And so they measured that achievement in classrooms. They have two studies. One is looking at how much experience you have with your instrument, and the other is looking at your achievement in classrooms on the instrument. And indeed, higher achieving music students do tend to select to do music, but a much stronger predictor in their studies, significantly more predictive, was whether they experienced need satisfaction with their music teacher in the prior year. So if you're looking at why students opt into an optional subject matter here, it's much more driven by the experience of need satisfaction in the classroom than it is even by the talent or achievement that you've had in the past, contrary to lots of people's predictions. Autonomy support and control is something that happens every day in classrooms. So every day in a classroom, a teacher can come in and be either more controlling than he or she usually is, or can be more autonomy supportive than they are usually. And our prediction is that on a given day, when teachers are more controlling, students' interest and engagement will go down on that day. On a day when they're more autonomy supportive, that interest and that engagement will go up. So this was one of the first studies we did on this. It's an older study that was done after my time at Max Planck Institute with Ulrich Trautwein and Yimu Sai. And what we did here was a multi-level model looking at 3 different subject matters in German classrooms. And Reinhardt, German studies just for you today. But these were mathematics. These were 7th graders who were taking mathematics, German, and a second language, which was either at that time Russian or English, was the common ones, mostly English classrooms for their second language. And then, so we looked at the between person level. So your average student's interest in that subject matter does predict their interest on a given day. And the mean level of their perceived autonomy supporting teachers does predict their average interest on a given day. And the same with their mean perceptions of control. But then controlling for those between student levels at the within person levels, on a day when the teacher is more autonomy supportive, interest goes up in the classroom. And on a day when there's more controlling behaviors, interest goes down. And this is true across all 3 subject matters in this age group. More recently, a daily variation in science classes was done by Erica Patel and her group in US students. And what she was able to show is that on days when teachers gave more choice, on days when they inquired about students' interests, on days when they gave a rationale for what was going on in the classroom and why we were learning a particular thing, on days when they asked more questions of students, there was an increase in engagement and motivation on those days. So we can see that this is not just a thing on average across things, but it's in every moment of teaching to the degree we can bring autonomy support to bear, better outcomes are occurring. Now, the really sad thing, and again, I'm going to pick on German classrooms here for a minute. This is a recent study that came out in German classrooms, but this is a pattern we see all over the place. When you look across years of schooling, we see less and less autonomy support going on rather than more and more, despite all this evidence. And this is 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th graders. It's a growth curve analysis. And you can see that students are perceiving teachers as being less and less autonomy supportive over that time, with a little bit of flip up in 9th grade. And then you can see the correlated outcomes with this, which is they're also being more dissatisfied with school. They're also less enjoyment of school and less self-rated health in school. As this autonomy support's going down, what doesn't change is their level of integration with friends, because that's independent of what's going on in the school classroom. So this to me is a common but a really sad story across the world. In fact, if you look at this from all grades, from like kindergarten through high school, the general pattern across the globe is decreasing intrinsic motivation, decreasing autonomy across the years, with only a few exceptions to that. Canada being one of them. At the end of school, they get more choice in terms of what the program looks like. So intrinsic motivation goes back up in Canadian schools at the end, but in most countries, it's a pretty much linear trend down. So one of the responses to that, I think, and here I really want to credit John Marshall, is we have to intervene. We have to help teachers learn to become more autonomy supportive. And, you know, really for years, I've been doing workshops with teachers really since the early 1980s on autonomy supportive techniques in classrooms, but I never systematized those workshops. They were always ad hoc, walk into a school, do something different with each group of teachers. But John Marshall and his group have, especially Chown, have systematized the interventions that are done. And we were able to put a book out recently that describes that intervention so that teachers could carry that out in their own schools, even without our leadership, or at least without the intense leadership of somebody who's an expert in SDT. Now, in SDT expert-led interventions, I think there were 51 that you reported on in this one article, and almost all of them work out to show a significant positive effect. In other words, teachers do pick up the techniques of autonomy support, and it shows in their classroom environments. And here's something from that's just a couple of printouts from the book. Here we just show the dual process model that SDT proposes, which is autonomy supported teaching is related to greater student need satisfaction, which is related to positive outcomes for students. And the opposite is true of controlling teachings. This is just kind of an example of how that dual process looks in research. So there's an intervention done. Some teachers get the intervention, some don't. They're in the control group. The expectation is that people who go through the intervention increase in their autonomy support, and that shows up in student outcomes. And you can see that happens here, which is that the intervention predicts greater autonomy satisfaction in students, which predicts their greater engagement over time. And autonomy frustration is negatively associated with participating in these workshops for teachers. So that's all good news. And one of the things that's really nice about this is it's kind of an experimental way of showing the relationships with the outcomes we expect. So experimental condition, people who are in the workshop, their students report more intrinsic motivation over time, and they show more internalization of extrinsic motivations and more identification in time as a result of their teachers participating in the workshop. And the result of that is an array of positive student outcomes that result from this. And these student outcomes are not just better performance in school, which of course a lot of people care about, but it's also greater well-being in school and lower antisocial kinds of behaviors. Now, one of the articles that came out from this group was one that I know Herb, you were involved with, showing that teachers who went through this workshop, students in their classroom engaged in less bullying, and they were more supportive of victims of bullying, a number of pro-social outcomes associated with that. I think this lower problematic behaviors also make the lives of teachers better. So one of the things that comes about because of these workshops is that teachers benefit as well. They're getting more satisfaction from teaching. They feel better relationships with their students. And because their students are acting out less, they have less strain and stress in the classroom and greater vitality, less emotional exhaustion. So it's a really beneficial thing for both students and teachers alike. So we have one study that's under review now that I got to participate in with this group. And it was on a construct that I've often had a very dim view of, which is called grit. So people say grit is a good thing for students to have. Grit is a combination of conscientiousness and persistence in what you're doing. And isn't that a good thing? And the reason I've never liked the construct is it's always going to be one of these blame the victim concepts. Well, if students aren't doing well in school, it's because they don't have enough grit. So somehow the problem of the adversity and the difficulty and the boredom and the drudgery of school is put onto the student as if it's their problem that they're not so deeply engaged in this material. So I've never liked the concept of grit. Similarly, I've never really liked the concept of mental toughness in the sport domain, which is a similar kind of idea. So you have a really horrible coach, but you should be able to put up with it because you're mentally tough. I don't think that's the case. So one of the kind of cool things in this study is showing that teachers who go through the experimental workshop, what happens to their students is over time they develop more grit. So what I really like about this finding is that usually people think grit comes about because of adversity, but we think grit comes about because of support. It's not because you have adversities and challenges that are besetting you all the time that you develop grit. It's because you have behind you a set of supports that help you know how to negotiate. This is just the model that the path model that grows out of this. And you can see here, of course, grit itself is a personality trait to some extent, but needs supportive circumstances in the classroom contribute to the increase in grit over the course of the year. And a very similar pattern, I'm not going to go deeply into this, but in a separate study showing the same pattern with mental toughness. So again, it's not adversity that builds our character strengths, but rather support. I think about what's going to build my children's conscientiousness in school. It's not going to be because I challenge them all the time and get really controlling with them, and then they learn to overcome my control. It's because they see my support behind them. They become more conscientious. And I'll say we've done a few studies in SDT that not in the school domain, but show that when you're around autonomy supportive people, you become more conscientious, you become more open, you become more extroverted, you become less neurotic, and you become more agreeable. So if you take any of the big five quote traits, we see that they're very situational. Your traits move in the direction of the support or the lack of support that you're feeling in there personally. So when you're with a person who's very supportive of you, you become more of these positive ends of the trait. So I just want to say we're just not researching students, we're researching teachers all the time. And because it's our belief that teachers can't be supportive of students in classrooms unless they themselves are getting support. And so we do a lot of studies on this. I'm just going to show one that we got to do in Hubei province with Yu Yan Ni and Beileng Chua and colleagues, where in a couple of the schools that were there, we were able to look at the teachers' perceived autonomy support from their principals and supervisors at the school. And if teachers felt that they were being supported in their autonomy, they showed more intrinsic motivation for teaching and more identified motivation for teaching and less external and less amotivated motivation for teaching. One interesting result in China was that when you had a very autonomy supportive supervisor, you're also more interjected, because we found out in interviews that many of our participants interpreted that as, if I have autonomy supportive principal, I do not want to disappoint them. I don't want to let them down. Nonetheless, the autonomous forms of motivation predict more job satisfaction and fewer ill symptoms. And interjection, while it produces more job satisfaction and remediation, it's also related to more ill symptoms itself. So it still has that double-edged sword of being a risk factor for people. But interesting results from China. Here in Australia, I was just down at UNSW and I finally got to meet Rebecca Coley, who works there. She's been doing a number of studies with teachers in Australia, showing that perceived autonomy support from their administrators is related to more need satisfaction, which is related to more positive forms of motivation, resulting in more job satisfaction and more commitment to their organization. And she did one recently looking at teacher turnover intentions, why teachers are leaving schools as much as they are. And you can see here that if you have autonomy supportive leadership, it's associated with more vitality and energy for your teaching. And this is associated with lower turnover intentions. On the other hand, autonomy thwarting leadership is directly related to people wanting to leave the profession of teaching. So these are Australian teachers. We can show this in a lot of different places. I'm going to skip over these things. It's been shown in Israel in a number of ways by Haya Kaplan and her group. Saudi Arabia, I really chose these two because sometimes people think these are very different cultures, but not so, at least when it comes to this particular problem. The more you have a supportive administrator for a teacher, the more your least are satisfied and the more committed you are to your job. And finally, Gavin Schlemp in a meta-analysis bears this out. This is a meta-analysis of just teachers' need satisfactions. And you can see that the degrees that teachers feel supported in their basic psychological needs, they tend to be more autonomous in their motivation. And that leads them not only to feel more well-being and less distress, but also more autonomy support with their students. There's a whole chain of studies in SDT that show that when teachers feel autonomous about their own teaching, they tend to be more autonomy supportive with students, and students in turn have more autonomy in the classroom. So these things, the teacher end of this really concerns me a lot. And particularly, I've been involved in a lot of school issues in the United States. And this is just a column that was written recently by a former teacher in the United States, a veteran teacher, who's just describing over 20 years what's happened in the classroom in the United States, which is there's been more and more mandates, more and more rules, more and more people watching the curriculum, more and more people telling them how they have to do their grading, introducing standard style grading. More and more they have requirements for exactly what they need to do in the classroom, how they need to keep up on the curriculum. And so what he experienced is that less and less autonomy in the classroom. As he says, by the end of it, the classroom was no longer mine. It really belonged to all these other administrators that came into the school and dictate what happens. And so as he argues in this thing, that you lose the best and the brightest teachers under a circumstance where they have less and less autonomy in classrooms. We've been seeing this globally. And we'll skip this particular thing. So I think the thing that most disturbs me after now my 40 years in this field of studying motivation is how little things have changed, and maybe even how they changed for the worse over this time. We have a huge gap between what we know about helps students thrive, it helps them perform well, it helps them become better citizens, and what our school policies are doing to our classrooms that eventuates in just the opposite happening. And I just want to give a few examples of this. And one of them is high stakes testing in China, in the US, in Great Britain, here in Australia. We have high stakes tests, and high stakes tests end up driving the curriculum into a very narrow sphere for all the teachers, decreasing their autonomy in how they teach in the classroom and forcing curriculum on students that may or may not be fit for that curriculum. People say it's for the.
There's no exception for life.
No exception.
All countries.
Yeah. Anywhere this is happening and used as high stakes tests. And so sadly, you see this impact on classrooms, and it's just gotten worse over the time I've been a researcher. And another one I'm going to use besides high stakes testing is the ubiquitous grading we do with students. Students are graded every day on everything they do. And I try and imagine any one of us who came in here and if Rhonda graded us every day on what we did. And how controlling and how
Doing that.
that's what she's doing over there. That's why I'm so nervous about talking. None of us would like this, and yet if we live through the eyes of a student every day, this is what they're doing. And sometimes I say, well, these are formative tests. There's no evidence that students see the difference between a formative test and a high stake test. They see a test. A test is a test is a test. And it's killing their motivation, and it's making them less intrinsically motivated to be in the classroom. I have never seen any good evidence for grading as a motivational device. And I say this across the board. I invite, every time I go to a talk that's filled with teachers or educational researchers, I say, show me evidence that grading is good for students' learning. There is none, but it's the most pervasive practice we see in schools. And if you ask people why they do it, they say, well, students won't work unless they're graded. It's like, where do you know that from? How do you know that? We don't know that. We know that, in fact, where there's been natural experiments where there hasn't been grading, students learn even more. There's been some natural experiments on this. For instance, there's some Norwegian classrooms where students from 4th to 7th grade did not get graded. And then they were introduced into regular grading systems in 7th grade. But they were outperforming the graded students at that point in time for the same curriculum. Grading is not a motivational device. It's not a learning aid, but it's the most pervasive thing we do all the time to students everywhere with no education psychology justification for it. And then finally, I'm just going to say STEM courses. We have a fetish for STEM. Everybody has to get STEM courses. We're all going to be scientists, technicians, and whatever else is in STEM here. Mathematics. Mathematics, I forgot that one. So, but why? How many students are actually going to go into STEM careers? How many people who graduate from our high schools, this is their core interest? And yet we drive the curriculum in the direction of STEM, meaning we're going to make sure that a good percentage of our students are disinterested and find it irrelevant to anything that's going on in their lives. And these are just 3 examples. I could have made a long list here of the things we're doing in school that have no evidence base and yet are the pervasive things that we're doing. And so kind of one of the reasons I wanted to give this talk today is just so I could rant a bit about this particular set of things. We're always focusing on outcomes in school rather than producing the best process. And in SDT, we say what we should be focusing on is good process within the classrooms. Good outcomes will result from good process, but when we focus on outcomes, we tend to drive out good process and best teaching behaviors in classrooms. I just finished a paper with the philosophers that I was telling you about and sociologists, and one of the ways that they've been thinking about this is that we need to create a worldwide movement that's focused on schools producing wellness as opposed to producing achievement. But the fight there is what they call neoliberal conceptions of the purposes of school, where we think the whole purpose of school is to prepare people for particular careers. And the argument that we would have is that preparing people for life would be more important. Preparing them to have emotional wellness would be more important. Then good things will happen for students, but doing this is producing bad outcomes in our schools. Now, all the interventions we do are happening inside classrooms at the moment. Most of our interventions are focused on the teacher and what she or he is doing inside of a classroom. We say, well, teachers can help their students because they put an umbrella up over their classroom. They practice in an autonomy supportive way. They're helping to buffer or protect their students from what? From the bad educational policies that dominate all of the countries in the world in terms of these things. And so that is a way into the schools, but it's not the best way. We need to be working more fiercely on policies. Right now, there's a lot of new books and techniques that are out there on helping teachers do better for students under that umbrella, but there's not enough out there attacking policy in particular. So those are my takeaways. My takeaways are that motivation is really important. Student wellness and thriving is really important, and we're not doing much to support it, at least at a policy level. But we do know that teachers can make a big difference every day in every classroom by being more autonomy supportive. So thanks.
We would have many questions, but I mean, one that really would interest me is this looks like Rich. I mean, this was a fantastic overview, like kind of a completed program of research, right? You did it all, including successful intervention. Now, what are the open questions from an SDT perspective, and what would be important next steps into the future? What are the open gaps, so to say? And I do not mean the research policy gap. Yes, but that's a completely different story. Right?
So the question on how we address the research policy gap is to provide good evidence for that gap and for the mistaken policies that are there. One way we can do that in our research thing is to find those natural experiments in schools where things are not done that way and to show the benefits of that. And so right now we're trying to actually assemble a group of educators that are parts of such schools and see if we can't start sharing practice knowledge from across schools that aren't engaged in this traditional kind of education. I think another open agenda is most of this work is focused on teachers and what teachers can do, but we can also focus on students. We can help them prepare more for how to undertake the education that they get, how to retain their autonomy in classrooms, even when it's constantly being undermined and eroded. And so that's the work on student agency within classrooms. I think that's an important one. I think another thing that's an important agenda for SDT that I'm not talking about here at all is when we get to specific contents in SDT, we can see that contents have different motivational value. Things like cognitive load in a classroom makes a difference in terms of how students experience the classroom. So you can design lessons to be more or less cognitive load, and particularly extraneous cognitive load. I think that's another agenda to be looking at. There's a bunch. I don't think of this as a completed research program at all. I do think we're at the level now where SDT's had so many studies done that meta-analyses are out there, and they're kind of convincing because you're not just saying, well, we found it here. You could say we found it across, 250,000 students. So this becomes a better evidence base, but that's just the beginning now to, okay, but how do we do the reform if we could make the space for it?
I expected this to be the answer.
Yeah. Everyone, do you have a? Oh, I don't.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think we should.
What did I get for a grade? But.
First of all, I think we should be writing the gaps between policy and evidence up as a book, everybody, because that would look really good for the university and give us all a pay rise, I think. So
You know, that's been my big motivation all along.
I don't believe in any of this, but you know, money like that extrinsic reward, fantastic. But I was going to ask.
You know, she's been at a lot of my talks. It's just driving me nuts.
But I mean, that would be awesome. Like when you did that, I thought we've got some of the best researchers sitting in the world and some of the most exciting emerging researchers sitting here. We should be writing, even if it's a journal article or a paper, we should be writing that and bringing the different theories and perspectives together, because schools are desperately needing that. The other thing I wanted to ask was, has this been looked at, like autonomy, supportive interventions in free schools, which, let's face it, are known for being very autonomy supportive in many ways, but in some ways young children may not perceive them as that because they have to do certain things at certain times. And the other question I had was at the other end, what about higher education? You know, looking at teachers like SDT facets with teachers compared to university students.
There has been a good amount of research really over the past few years in higher education. Surprisingly, there was a lot more research in secondary schools than in higher education. And I've often wondered why, but then I've tried to do research in my own higher education institutions, and I can tell you why. College professors won't let you into their classroom. They don't want you to get students to rate their performance in classroom. They don't want to see the answers to those questions. They have a way of resisting that a lot of secondary school teachers have not been able to have, or have not, or they've actually been interested in the feedback, whereas college professors tend not to be. That said, there's been an increasing amount of research done, and I just want to kind of point out one. Wrong way here. One book that I really do like that came out recently by a guy named Patrick Whitehead on classroom techniques for higher education. It's not as good as John Marshall's book, but it's a really good book that discusses that at the college and university level, what things that you can introduce in your classroom to make the classroom more autonomy supportive. By the way, if people interested in literature out there, this is also just one of my favorite books out there, Breaking into the Heart of Character by David Straight and colleagues. It's just a really beautifully written book about why basic psychological needs are really important in classrooms. But I don't think there's been enough research on higher education, certainly not research that's influenced policy as strongly as not. Another one, though, that I would say is looking at that is Chantal Levesque's book on putting motivation to scale in the university setting. So this book is also about policy making in universities, not specifically just SDT, but what we can be doing to support students better at the higher education level. So there's some work going on out there. It's not as systematic as the work that's been done in elementary and secondary schools.
Yeah, I think it'd be fascinating to just look at that comparison with lecturers and students. Michael over there is looking at well-being for Indigenous students at university. And I just thought, oh, that could be part of the study. So I hope you've written down the names of those books, Michael. And then the other part was preschool.
It's right up here. John Marshall, would you have anything to add to that, my answer to that question as to why there hasn't been systematic stuff done in higher ed? Not really. That pregnant pause.
Participation rates of university students are often so low, 20%, 25%, and so on. It's extremely difficult as compared with primary secondary school.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
What about the nucleus rich? I mentioned.
Oh, I'm sorry.
As well.
You know, I haven't seen a lot of studies on that, but one of the things I have seen, Rhonda, is this huge variation in preschool settings in terms of how controlling and autonomy supportive they are. You see some preschools where they're already starting a first grade and second grade curriculum in kids that are 4 years old, and I think it's developmentally wrong. I also think to do so, you have to be controlling in order to have that take place. And this is a trend within a lot of preschool kind of atmospheres. And I think it's a sad trend because that's an age in which students, kids should be learning to play, to socialize, to relate to one another. Those are the main tasks of that developmental period, not reading already. And I don't think the evidence is there for that early education as being beneficial for students. So I think we'd find a lot of variation. We could find a lot of preschools, we could find a lot of variation in that, and we would see a lot of differences in wellness. And then I think positive engagement in schooling subsequently, because this is setting the stage for their understanding of what schooling is. And sadly, if you ask most students their conception of school, it's a pretty dark picture that they portray. And again, it goes back to what is their experience every day. The experience of students every day is to be evaluated, is to be controlled, is to have their behavior micromanaged. Again, if any of us had to live through that, we wouldn't. We would find a new job, but they don't get that choice. They can't go find a new job. They have to stick out the environment that they're in, and that's why we need to change that environment.
Online question there for you, Rich? Sure.
Yeah.
So it was the online questions.
Yeah.
Jane Boyle.
Yeah.
Says, I wonder whether there's been any research linking educational concept of way of teaching, such as inquiry-based learning and the link with autonomy. There's a lot in education discussing the move away from inquiry-based learning approaches and more prescriptive ways of teaching, such as explicit teaching. And I do, Jane, I do know that that's a great question because there is a lot of dialogue going on about this. I think inquiry-based education at its best can be really autonomy supported because it allows for more ownership over the activities that you're engaged in, and therefore more sense of autonomy in what you're doing. I will also say this, though, you can take any single approach. You can take inquiry-based approach, you can take explicit learning approach, and you can make it controlling. Or you can make it autonomy supported when it comes back to John Marshall's basic graph before, which is whatever your structure is, if you don't do it with the spirit of autonomy support, it won't have a positive impact. So.
It's my intuition that there's huge differences in different disciplines as to the extent to which autonomy supported teaching is natural. Not natural, it's used, but it's not used. I know my wife was an art teacher, and when I described what autonomy supported teaching is, that's what art teachers do. So it's natural, whereas we're talking about the STEM classes. It isn't essential, but it seems like they're at the opposite end in terms of actually autonomy supported. I was wondering, there's been research looking at different discipline differences.
I can tell you anecdotally from doing a lot of teacher workshops more than I can tell you what the research shows, that teachers in science and mathematics will tend to think, look, I have too much curriculum to jam in here. I don't have time for this other stuff. And the main thing I would say to them is, if you don't take the time for this other stuff, you won't jam that stuff in. And that's what the results show. So I think that oftentimes it's thought of as something superfluous or something extra that you're doing, when in fact it's part of the core aspect of teaching itself. So some of this is socializing math teachers in particular, to say how you introduce math matters, how you introduce the rationale for a problem matters. And you can see country to country differences in the style of teaching mathematics in terms of this, whether there's a rationale for why we're doing this thing, the degree to which I can do different kind of projects with my mathematics. There's a lot of variation that can be had, even when in that subject matter that's not exploited all that well. But I think your intuition's a right one. I can say right now I'm doing a lot of education of in hospitals of supervising physicians and supervising nurses. And there are certain disciplines within hospitals that are very resistant to this, and particularly surgeons. Surgeons are like mathematics teachers. They think, that autonomy support stuff, it's fluff. But they also have high dropout rates among their people. They have low diversity among the people who make it through. There's a lot of issues in surgery that really come about because of bad motivational styles of surgery supervisors who think there's no room for humanity in the midst of these things. I think that's just wrong.
I got a question, Rich, which just out of curiosity, which is, let's say, both methodological and conceptual. So there has been so much debate recent years about the within person versus between person divide, right? And the classic argument is the two sets of these two levels and the related sets of findings diverge, right? And we should not trust any between person findings to infer, and the other way around also. what you are finding, what you showed us, if I saw it
Yeah.
correctly, what we are finding as well is much more convergence
Yeah.
that would have been anticipated from these methodological perspectives alone. Now, the question is why? So how could we explain, let's say, the equivalence of between person covariations as being driven by within person processes or the other way around, right? Within, I mean, bottom up.
Part of the reason I think we find convergence is we think that the practices that are done at a group level have an influence on the motivation at the individual level. And so controlling practices at the group level will feel controlling at the individual level, and then they have that same effect. So I think we look for parallel processes. And as you're right, methodologically, there's presumably separate variances. They don't have to be related to one another, but they are systematically related to one another. And all
The question is why, right? How could we explain this conversion? But I think it's really dramatically important across disciplines in psychology, at least, right?
Yeah.
For explaining, I mean, the ontogenesis of personality traits over years.
Well, so we can track that like the between person level of, say, a controlling teacher that's controlling on as a trait basis. That will have a trait outcome associated in the classroom. There'll be some kind of common interest, but again, that individual switch, that movement from baseline also has an impact. And so I don't think that those are independent processes. That movement over time would eventuate in a collective change if it was steady. Trouble is there is dynamics in that. So there's probably some areas where people would expect divergent processes, but we don't expect them in this model.
If the exogenous confounders that moderate the relations. Other than that, I would agree. I mean, if there is a state process, then in the end it crystallizes into traits, right?
Yeah.
And traits drive equivalent states within each moment.
Yeah.
So
what's kind of interesting, one place we do see some, I don't know if it's divergence, but you see that that when students have chronically low motivation or are controlled in their motivation, they benefit more from an autonomy supportive environment. So you see that there's a more effect for those who start out worse off. So a lot of people would think the opposite is the case, that it's students who already have autonomy who would benefit from autonomy supportive classrooms, what we call a match hypothesis. But we routinely don't find support for the match hypothesis. In fact, if anything, it's the opposite. It's the students with the low motivation who benefit the most from a more enriching, need supportive classroom. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for your patience today, and I'm so glad this is over. That's it, class dismissed.
Ladies, will you start?
brilliant.